They said General Valira Thorne could sleep through orbital bombardments, but the truth was far worse. She never slept at all. The salvage beacon pulsed faintly through the storm, buried beneath layers of static and drifting plasma ash, as Ethan Cole guided his rust-scarred maintenance shuttle through the debris field surrounding Kepri Station 9. The old station had died almost 8 months ago, after a reactor collapse tore through its central ring, leaving thousands of tons of metal drifting silently above the frozen moon below. Most pilots avoided the area now. Too unstable. Too haunted. Ethan came because abandoned places still paid if you knew where to look. The cockpit lights flickered across his stubbled face while warning alarms muttered softly in the background. Outside the viewport, twisted pieces of warships rotated through darkness like the bones of forgotten giants. A fractured Dominion cruiser drifted ahead of him, nearly half a mile long, its silver-black hull scorched from ancient plasma fire. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The distress signal was coming from inside. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered quietly. The cruiser looked dead enough to belong in a museum, but signals didn't lie. He docked through an emergency breach near the aft engineering section, magnetic clamps locking against the damaged hull with a hollow, metallic thud. Cold air hissed into the loading bay as Ethan stepped through the airlock wearing his gray work jacket and utility harness, a handheld lantern clipped to his shoulder. The corridor beyond looked frozen in time. Emergency lights blinked weakly overhead. Frost covered the walls in pale blue veins. Somewhere deep inside the ship, metal groaned like an animal trying not to wake up. Ethan moved carefully through the silence. His boots crunched over shattered glass and old shell casings scattered across the floor, faintly of ozone and burned circuitry. Dominion warships always carried that smell, like thunderstorms trapped inside steel. The distress beacon grew louder as he descended toward the lower command decks. Then he heard it. Breathing. Not mechanical. Human-sized. Slow. Controlled. Ethan froze instantly. The sound came from the darkness ahead. He lifted the lantern carefully. A figure sat motionless against the far wall beneath flickering red lights. Tall. Broad shoulders. Silver armor marked with deep black scratches. One armored hand rested against the floor, while the other held a combat knife angled toward the corridor entrance. The blade never shook. Ethan's stomach tightened. He recognized the insignia immediately. Crimson Dominion High Command. 14 campaign bars. Twin eclipse medals. The shattered silver wolf crest worn only by one person in the entire galaxy. "No way," he whispered. General Valira Thorne slowly lifted her head. Her skin carried the deep blue-violet tone of storm clouds at dusk, marked by faint pale scars crossing her throat and jawline. White hair spilled loosely across one shoulder, partially covering one glowing amber eye. The other eye remained hidden in shadow. She looked less like a soldier and more like something war itself had forgotten to bury. The knife tightened in her hand. Ethan noticed something strange then. Every 12 seconds exactly, her shoulders jerked slightly. Tiny muscle reflexes, like her body was bracing for impacts that never came. Combat conditioning. Severe. Her gaze locked onto him instantly. Sharp, exhausted, dangerous. "State your allegiance," she said. Her voice sounded rough from dehydration, but perfectly steady. Ethan raised one hand slowly away from his belt. "Relax. I'm just salvage crew. You entered a classified Dominion vessel." "Yeah, well, your classified vessel's been floating dead in space for 8 months. Silence filled the corridor. The emergency lights buzzed overhead. Valera's eyes never blinked. Ethan could feel her studying every movement he made, measuring angles, distance, threat probabilities. Even sitting half-collapsed against a ruined wall, she carried the weight of someone trained to survive impossible things. Then, suddenly, the ship groaned violently beneath them. Somewhere overhead, collapsing metal thundered through the cruiser's upper decks. Ethan barely had time to react before the lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the corridor. In the blackness, he heard movement, fast, precise. The cold edge of a blade pressed instantly against his throat. Ethan stopped breathing. He could smell smoke and steel on her armor now, feel the heat of her breath near his ear. "If this is an extraction team," Valera whispered coldly, "tell them they should have sent more ships." Ethan stayed perfectly still for 2 long seconds. Then, quietly, carefully, he said, "Lady, if I wanted to hurt you, I probably wouldn't have shown up carrying a flashlight and a toolbox." Nothing moved. Somewhere deep inside the ruined cruiser, another warning siren began to howl softly through the dark. The blade remained against Ethan's throat for 3 more seconds, before slowly pulling away into the darkness. Somewhere above them, loose metal groaned again as the dead cruiser shifted inside the debris field. Then the emergency lights flickered back to life, 1 row at a time, staining the corridor in dim red pulses. Valera still sat against the wall, exactly where she had been, but now Ethan noticed the faint tremor in her breathing. Controlled, hidden, exhausted. The combat knife never left her hand. Ethan rubbed the side of his neck carefully and exhaled through his nose. "Okay," he muttered quietly. "Definitely not the friendliest salvage operation I have ever had." Valera ignored the comment completely. Her glowing amber eyes tracked every movement he made, while distant warning sirens echoed through the cruiser like dying animals. "Why are you alone?" she asked suddenly. Ethan unclipped the lantern from his shoulder and crouched beside a damaged control panel near the wall. "Because nobody smart takes jobs out here." Sparks crackled softly inside the exposed circuitry while he examined the ship's failing emergency grid. "Most crews think this sector is cursed." "And you do not?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Rent is expensive." For the first time, something almost resembling confusion crossed her face. Tiny, gone in a second. Ethan noticed it anyway. He pulled a portable battery pack from his toolkit and connected it to the damaged panel. The corridor lights steadied slightly, enough to reveal more details beneath the general's battered armor. Burn marks crossed one shoulder plate. Frost had gathered along the edges of her gloves. One side of her uniform was darkened from dried coolant and blood he chose not to ask about. But it was her posture that bothered him most. Every muscle stayed locked tight, even while sitting still, like her body had forgotten how to exist without danger. Ethan had seen it before. Veterans, miners after tunnel collapses, pilots after deep space isolation, people whose nervous systems stopped believing in quiet rooms. "You need medical attention," he said calmly. "Negative. You are bleeding through 3 layers of armor. I said negative." Ethan sighed softly and stood. "Right. Soldier in the galaxy. I get it." Valera's gaze sharpened instantly. "You know who I am." "Pretty hard not to." He leaned against the wall beside the control panel. "The Dominion broadcasts your face across half the systems in civilized space." Her expression hardened like steel cooling in ice water. "Propaganda." "Maybe." Ethan glanced at the campaign medals still attached to her chest plate. Still means people know your name. Silence settled between them again. Only the humming emergency lights and distant metallic groans filled the corridor. Then Valera spoke quietly enough that he almost missed it. Names are useful in war. Ethan looked at her carefully. And outside war? She did not answer. Somewhere deeper inside the cruiser, another system failed with a low electrical whine. The floor vibrated beneath their feet. Ethan checked the readings on his wrist scanner and frowned immediately. Radiation spikes. Structural collapse probabilities climbing fast. This ship is coming apart, he said. We need to leave. Valera's hand tightened around the knife again. I am not returning to Dominion Command. Good news, Ethan replied dryly. I am not Dominion Command. He stepped closer, slowly, careful not to move too fast. Look, I have a repair station about 30 miles from here on the outer mining ring. Quiet place. No military traffic. You can stay long enough to recover. And afterward? Afterward, you can leave whenever you want. Valera studied him with visible suspicion. Humans do not help without motive. Ethan gave a tired little smile. That must mean you have met the wrong humans. Another long silence followed. Ethan could almost hear her mind working behind those glowing amber eyes, calculating risks and betrayal probabilities the same way soldiers measured ammunition. Then, suddenly, her shoulders jerked hard again. 12 seconds exactly. This time, Ethan noticed the tiny flinch in her eyes right before it happened. Anticipation. Like her body expected incoming fire on a timer only she could hear. General, he said carefully, how long have you been awake? Valera's expression did not change. 22 days. Ethan stared at her for a second. You are kidding. Dominion combat stimulants delay neural fatigue. Yeah, well, your neural fatigue looks pretty delayed already. She ignored the sarcasm completely. But he noticed something then. Her focus drifted for less than a second. Tiny, dangerous. The kind of exhaustion that slipped past discipline no matter how strong somebody was. Ethan grabbed his toolkit and moved toward the corridor exit. Come on. I did not agree. Lady, this entire ship sounds like it is one bad vibration away from becoming a cloud of scrap metal. He glanced back at her. You can either threaten me on my shuttle, or threaten me while floating unconscious through vacuum. Personally, I think the shuttle has better seating. For several seconds, Valera remained perfectly still beneath the flickering red lights. Then slowly, with visible reluctance, she pushed herself upright against the wall. Ethan heard the faint hiss of damaged armor joints as she stood to her full height. Even exhausted, she towered over him. The knife remained in her hand. Of course it did. Ethan only nodded toward the corridor ahead. After you, General. Valera stared at him coldly. You are either brave or profoundly stupid. Ethan adjusted the lantern on his shoulder and started walking. That is pretty much what everybody keeps telling me. The shuttle rattled violently as Ethan guided it through the debris field surrounding Kepri Station 9, old metal fragments scraping against the outer shields with hollow metallic shrieks. The cockpit smelled faintly of machine oil and overheated wiring, while navigation lights flickered across the windshield in nervous pulses of blue and amber. Valera sat motionless in the co-pilot seat beside him, still wearing her damaged armor, still holding the combat knife loosely across one thigh. She had not relaxed once during the entire flight, not when the engines stalled briefly near the radiation belt, not when the hull alarms screamed during atmospheric turbulence. Not even when Ethan handed her a thermal blanket after noticing frost gathering along her shoulders. She simply stared forward through the cockpit glass like someone expecting space itself to attack her. Ethan adjusted the steering controls with one hand while sipping stale coffee from a steel mug balanced near the dashboard. "You know," he said casually, "most passengers usually complain about the ride by now." Valera did not blink. "Your shuttle sounds unhealthy." "That is because it is unhealthy." "Then why does it still function?" Ethan smirked faintly. Spite. For half a second, her expression shifted again, confusion mixed with something quieter. The shuttle descended toward the outer mining ring, slowly emerging through layers of drifting ice clouds below. The station looked less like a spaceport and more like a collection of welded-together cargo containers hanging from a rotating steel framework nearly 400 feet wide. Half the exterior lights were burned out. One communications antenna leaned slightly sideways. Steam vented lazily from the lower maintenance decks into the frozen vacuum around the ring. "This is your residence?" Valera asked flatly. "Do not sound too impressed." Ethan guided the shuttle toward docking bay 12. "She is old, loud, and held together by industrial adhesive, but she keeps oxygen inside and vacuum outside. That is really all I ask from a home." The docking clamps locked with a heavy thud beneath them. Ethan stood first, grabbing his toolbox and heavy jacket, before glancing toward Valera. "Fair warning," he said. "The heating system likes to quit whenever temperatures drop below 0. "What temperature is it now?" Ethan checked the cracked monitor near the airlock. -23. Valera stared at him silently. "See?" Ethan said with a tired smile. "Still plenty of time before things get uncomfortable." The station interior smelled like soldered metal, recycled air, and fresh coffee beans. Dim industrial lights lined the corridor ceilings, while old ventilation fans hummed softly behind the walls. Ethan walked ahead through the narrow hallway, carrying a portable lantern, while Valera followed several feet behind him without making a sound. Even exhausted, she moved like a trained predator. Careful, efficient. Her eyes scanned every doorway automatically, every reflective surface, every corner. Ethan noticed she counted exits without even realizing she was doing it. They reached the central living quarters near the station core 15 minutes later. The room was surprisingly warm compared to the rest of the station. Copper pipes rattled softly behind the walls. A small radio near the kitchen counter played low jazz music through static interference. Several shelves filled with repair manuals, machine parts, and old paper books lined one wall beside a narrow window overlooking the frozen moon below. Valera stopped walking. Her glowing amber eyes settled slowly on the books first, then the coffee pot, then the soft yellow light hanging above the kitchen table. Ethan shrugged off his jacket and tossed it over a chair. Welcome to luxury living. Valera remained standing near the doorway. "You live alone, usually." Ethan moved toward the kitchen counter and began filling a kettle with water from the purifier tank. "Closest neighbor is about 600 miles away." The kettle clicked softly onto the burner. Blue flame flickered beneath it. Valera's shoulders jerked instantly. Small, violent. Her knife appeared in her hand before Ethan even realized she had moved. The room went silent, except for the low hiss of burning gas. Ethan froze halfway through reaching for a coffee tin. Valera's breathing sharpened slightly. Her glowing eyes locked onto the flame beneath the kettle, like it had transformed into something alive. Ethan understood immediately. Combat reflex, flash ignition, battlefield association. "Easy," he said quietly. "It is just the stove." Valera did not answer. Every muscle in her body remained rigid. Ethan slowly reached down and turned the burner off completely. The tiny flame disappeared. Silence settled back into the room. After several long seconds, Valera lowered the knife again, barely. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter and studied her carefully beneath the soft kitchen lights. "How long since the war ended?" he asked quietly.
4 years.
"And your body still thinks it is happening." Valera stared at the dark stove without speaking. The station hummed softly around them while frozen stars drifted beyond the window glass. Then, finally, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "On the final day of the Quran offensive, I remained awake for 91 consecutive hours." Ethan said nothing. "The bombardments never stopped," she continued softly. "Neither did the casualty reports." Her voice stayed calm, mechanical, like reading weather data from a damaged screen. After enough time, silence itself becomes suspicious. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward the radio near the kitchen shelf and adjusted the dial slightly. Soft trumpet music filled the room beneath layers of old static. Warm, slow, human. Frowned faintly. "What is this?" "Jazz. It sounds unstructured." Ethan smiled while pouring water into 2 ceramic mugs. "That is kind of the point." Valera stood perfectly still beneath the kitchen lights while the old music drifted softly through the station. Her knife remained in her hand. But for the first time since Ethan found her aboard the ruined cruiser, the blade pointed toward the floor instead of toward him. The station lights dimmed automatically at 0200 hours, shifting from warm amber to low blue night illumination, while frozen stars drifted silently beyond the reinforced windows. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, nursing his second cup of coffee, while maintenance reports scrolled across an old tablet screen beside him. Somewhere deeper in the station, ventilation pipes rattled softly behind steel walls. Otherwise, the entire mining ring felt dead quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He glanced toward the hallway leading to the guest quarters he had cleared out earlier that evening. Valera had disappeared inside nearly 2 hours ago without another word. He figured she was either sleeping or pretending to. Honestly, he was not sure which possibility sounded stranger. Ethan leaned back in his chair carefully, rubbing tired eyes with one hand, while static, heavy jazz music hummed softly from the radio shelf nearby. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Metallic. He barely had time to stand before the guest room door slid open hard enough to strike the wall. Valera emerged instantly, knife already in hand, amber eyes wide and unfocused beneath strands of silver-white hair. Her breathing sounded sharp, uneven. Ethan froze immediately. "General?" She did not seem to hear him. Her gaze scanned the room rapidly, like she was searching for incoming threats invisible to everyone else. Every muscle in her body looked locked between fight and panic. Noticed sweat shimmering faintly across the blue-violet skin near her temples, despite the freezing station temperature. Combat nightmare. Severe. Valera. Her eyes snapped toward him instantly. The knife tightened in her grip. Ethan kept his voice low and steady. "You are on Kepri Ring. Safe station. No combat zones." Her chest rose and fell rapidly. "The bombardment," she whispered. "I heard orbital sirens." Ethan glanced toward the radio. A trumpet solo drifted softly through static interference. Slow, melancholy, human. "That was music," he said gently. Valera blinked once. Confusion flickered across her face. Then the station's heating system groaned loudly somewhere overhead. Instantly her shoulders jerked again. The knife came up reflexively. Ethan stepped forward before thinking too hard about it. "Hey." His voice stayed calm, grounded. "Look at me." Valera's glowing eyes locked onto his. "You are not on a battlefield." Silence stretched between them while old ventilation fans hummed softly through the station walls. Ethan could practically see her mind trying to separate memory from reality. Then, slowly, inch by inch, her grip loosened slightly around the knife handle. Ethan exhaled quietly. "There you go." Valera stared at him for several long seconds before finally lowering the blade toward the floor again. Her breathing remained uneven. "My nervous system responds before conscious thought," she said quietly. "Dominion combat conditioning enhances survival reflexes." "Yeah," Ethan replied softly. "I noticed." The room fell quiet again. Valera stood motionless beneath the blue night lights, while distant stars reflected faintly across the polished black edges of her damaged armor. For the first time since arriving, she suddenly looked less like a legendary commander and more like someone profoundly tired. Ethan carefully slid the kitchen chair away from the table with one foot. "Sit down before you fall down." "I do not require rest." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Lady, you almost attacked a jazz station because your brain thought a trumpet was artillery fire." Her expression hardened slightly. "That is not amusing." "No," Ethan admitted quietly. "It is not." Valera hesitated before finally sitting down with visible reluctance. The chair creaked softly beneath the weight of her armor. Ethan moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing another kettle of hot water while keeping one eye on her the entire time. He noticed she positioned herself facing both exits automatically. Some habits lived deeper than thought. Steam rose gently from the kettle, while the scent of mint leaves filled the warm little kitchen. Valera watched him carefully. "What are you doing?" "Tea." "Why?" Ethan shrugged lightly while placing a ceramic mug in front of her. "Because humans tend to give warm drinks to exhausted people." She studied the cup suspiciously. "It contains medicinal compounds?" "Mostly mint." Valera stared down at the steam curling upward from the mug. Her shoulders twitched faintly again after exactly 12 seconds. Ethan noticed this time her eyes closed briefly beforehand, like she already knew the reflex was coming and hated it. "You count them," he said quietly. Her gaze lifted immediately. "What?" "The spasms." Ethan leaned against the counter. "You know exactly when they happen." Silence. Then, finally, she answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "Every 12 seconds during the siege alarms, orbital impact probabilities updated across our neural implants." Ethan felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Your body still expects the next warning. Valera looked down at the untouched tea again. There was always another warning. The station hummed softly around them, while frozen moonlight drifted through the window glass in pale silver patterns. Ethan stayed quiet for a moment before moving toward the radio shelf. He adjusted the frequency slowly until softer music filled the room. Piano this time, slow enough to breathe with. Valera listened carefully. Her expression remained guarded, but something inside it shifted. Tiny, fragile. "This music," she said softly. "It does not anticipate anything." Ethan looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug. That is kind of why humans like it. Valera sat motionless beneath the dim blue station lights, staring into the rising steam from the tea while the old piano melody drifted gently through the quiet room. Then, for the first time since Ethan found her floating through the ruins of war, the combat knife resting beside her hand remained untouched for nearly an entire minute. The next morning began with the sound of metal tools clattering against the station floor and somebody quietly swearing at a ventilation shaft. Pale white sunlight from the frozen moon drifted through the kitchen windows, while steam rolled lazily from exposed heating pipes overhead. Ethan lay halfway beneath an open maintenance panel near the central hallway, one boot sticking out beside a scattered pile of wrenches and replacement circuits. "Come on," he muttered at the wiring above him. "You survived 2 reactor collapses. You can survive 1 winter." The ventilation system answered with a loud grinding noise, followed by complete silence. Ethan sighed heavily. That is not encouraging. He slid out from beneath the panel and wiped grease across his sleeve, just as he noticed Valera standing at the far end of the hallway. She had changed sometime during the night. The damaged Dominion armor was gone, replaced by loose gray station clothes Ethan had left outside the guest quarters earlier. Even without the armor, she still carried herself like military command given physical form. Straight posture, controlled breathing, eyes constantly moving. But something about seeing the galaxy's most feared general standing barefoot beside a flickering coffee machine made the entire universe feel slightly unreal. Valera studied the exposed machinery near the floor. "Your station appears structurally unsound." Ethan grabbed a wrench from the floor. "That is because it is structurally unsound." "Then why remain here?" "Cheap docking fees." Valera tilted her head slightly. "You answer serious questions with humor." Ethan stood carefully, rubbing stiffness from his shoulder. "Usually means I am avoiding serious answers." The kitchen lights flickered overhead again. Ethan pointed the wrench toward the ceiling. "See? Even the station knows emotional vulnerability is uncomfortable." Valera stared at him silently for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, a faint sound escaped her throat. Not quite laughter, more like her nervous system remembering the shape of it. Ethan froze briefly. Was that a sense of humor? Her expression immediately flattened again. "No. Pretty sure it was." "You are mistaken." Ethan grinned while returning to the maintenance panel. "I am writing this moment down." Valera moved quietly through the station afterward while Ethan repaired failing systems one section at a time. She said little. Mostly she observed. The old mining ring hummed around them with tired mechanical life. Air recyclers rattled softly through the walls. Cargo lifts groaned in distant corridors. Somewhere below the station core, ancient pipes knocked rhythmically like a heartbeat inside steel bones. Ethan worked through all of it with casual familiarity, tightening bolts, replacing circuits, drinking entirely too much coffee. Valera followed him for nearly 2 hours before finally speaking again.
"You perform all maintenance alone?" Ethan nodded while reconnecting a power conduit overhead. "Mostly. This station requires a crew. Probably." Sparks flashed briefly near his hands. "But crews ask for salaries." Valera leaned lightly against the corridor wall, watching him carefully. "Your species forms social groups instinctively, yet you isolate yourself here." Ethan tightened the final bolt and climbed down from the ladder slowly. "You always analyze people this much." "It was necessary." "During war?" "During survival." Ethan nodded once. That answer felt honest. He walked toward the observation deck, carrying his toolbox, while Valera followed several steps behind.
The large circular window overlooking the frozen moon had partially frosted over during the night, pale ice crystals spreading across the glass like silver veins. Ethan wiped part of the window clean with his sleeve before sitting on a storage crate nearby. "Best view on the station," he said quietly. Valera stepped closer to the glass. Far below them, frozen plains stretched endlessly beneath drifting storms of white dust and blue ice. In the distance, abandoned mining towers rose from the surface like black skeletons against the snow. Everything looked still enough to last forever. "It is quiet," she said softly. Ethan leaned back against the wall.
"That bothered me too when I first moved here."
Valera glanced toward him.
You were military.
It was not a question. Ethan nodded once.
"Combat medic."
Her eyes narrowed slightly.
Frontline deployment?
3 years.
And afterward you chose isolation.
Ethan stared out the window for a long moment before answering.
After enough emergencies, silence starts feeling expensive.
Valera looked back toward the frozen world below. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then, suddenly, the station intercom crackled loudly overhead with a burst of static. Instantly, Valera's body reacted. Her shoulders snapped tight, her breathing sharp. Ethan saw her pulse jump visibly beneath the blue-violet skin of her throat. But this time her hand did not reach for the knife. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly. One breath, then another. The tension remained, but she stayed still. Ethan noticed immediately. So did she. Valera opened her eyes slowly, almost confused by her own restraint. Ethan smiled faintly from the storage crate. "Look at that." "What?" "You did not reach for the blade." Valera remained motionless beside the observation window, while pale moonlight reflected across her silver-white hair. "I noticed," she admitted quietly. Ethan picked up his coffee mug again.
"Guess your nervous system is finally figuring out this place is boring."
Valera looked out across the frozen silence below the station. Then, softly, almost to herself, she said, "I do not remember the last place that felt boring." Ethan watched her reflection in the glass for a moment. The old radio somewhere behind them played soft piano through static interference, while snowstorms drifted slowly across the moon beneath the station. For the first time since arriving, Valera no longer looked like someone preparing for the next battle. She looked like someone trying to remember what existed before them. 3 days later, Valera discovered the garden by accident. The lower maintenance corridors beneath Kepri Ring were colder than the rest of the station, lined with old reactor pipes and storage rooms forgotten decades ago by mining crews, long since retired or dead. Dim utility lights buzzed overhead, while condensation drifted through the air in pale white clouds. Valera moved silently through the corridor, carrying a thermal mug of untouched tea in one hand, her bare footsteps nearly soundless against the steel floor. Sleep still came in fragments. 30 minutes here, 20 there. But the combat reflexes no longer struck every 12 seconds. Sometimes nearly 20 passed now before her shoulders tightened again. Ethan called that progress. Valera was still deciding whether she hated him for noticing. She stopped near a sealed pressure door at the end of corridor C-19. Warm air leaked faintly through the edges. Strange. No active systems should have been running this deep below the station core. The door slid open with a low hydraulic hiss when she approached. Warm light spilled into the corridor instantly. Valera froze. Plants. Hundreds of them. Soft green vines climbed across suspended lattice frames, beneath rows of artificial sunlight panels glowing overhead in pale gold. Small fruit trees lined the walls in recycled mineral soil.
Flowers drifted gently beneath air circulators, while water trickled quietly through narrow irrigation channels built into the floor. The entire chamber smelled alive. Fresh soil, humidity, leaves warmed beneath artificial sunlight. Bailira stepped inside slowly. Her glowing amber eyes moved across the hidden greenhouse in stunned silence.
I was wondering when you would find this place.
Ethan's voice echoed softly from somewhere behind the tomato vines. Bailira turned sharply. He sat atop an overturned supply crate, wearing an old grey sweatshirt streaked with dirt, holding a wrench in one hand and a watering hose in the other.
You built this,
she said quietly. Ethan shrugged.
Mostly.
He gestured around the chamber. Turns out mining stations are less depressing when something grows inside them. Bailira moved deeper into the greenhouse slowly, fingertips brushing against broad green leaves with visible caution.
These species are not native to this sector.
Earth imports, Ethan replied. Took years to stabilize the oxygen balance down here. He pointed toward a cluster of small citrus trees beneath the lights. Those nearly killed the station twice. Bailira stared at the leaves trembling softly beneath the circulators overhead.
You created an ecosystem beneath a mining ring.
Ethan grinned faintly. That sounds smarter when you say it out loud. She ignored the joke completely.
Her attention remained fixed on a small flowering vine climbing one corner wall. Tiny white blossoms swayed gently beneath the warm, artificial sunlight. Bailira reached toward one carefully. Fragile, she murmured. Ethan adjusted a water valve nearby. Yeah, most living things are. Bailira stood motionless for several seconds. Then quietly she asked, "Why protect something so temporary?" Ethan glanced toward her. Because temporary things still matter. The greenhouse hummed softly around them. Water pumps clicked gently beneath the floor. Somewhere above, distant station machinery vibrated through steel beams like faraway thunder. But down here, the sounds felt softened, distant, safe.
Bailira closed her eyes briefly. Ethan noticed her shoulders remained completely still. No reflex spasm, no combat tension. Just breathing. Slow. Human, almost.
There are no alarms here,
she said softly. Ethan nodded. No communications either. Signal interference from the lower reactor shell blocks transmissions. Bailira opened her eyes again slowly.
So nobody can reach you. That is kind of the appeal.
Ethan walked toward a storage shelf and grabbed a small pair of gardening shears before handing them toward her. Bailira stared at the tool uncertainly.
What is this for?
Those vines need trimming.
You are assigning me agricultural labor.
Ethan leaned casually against the hydroponic tanks.
General, if you can command orbital fleets, I am pretty sure you can handle basil. For half a second, something dangerous almost appeared in her expression. Then, unexpectedly, it disappeared beneath the faintest trace of amusement. Bailira took the shears carefully. Ethan spent the next hour teaching her how to trim dead leaves from the vines without damaging the stems. She moved awkwardly at first, hands far more familiar with weapons than living plants. But gradually her motions slowed, softened. Ethan noticed something strange then. Whenever Bailira focused on the plants, her breathing stabilized completely. No tension spikes, no involuntary reactions. Her nervous system stopped waiting for disaster long enough to exist in the moment. Eventually, they sat together beside the irrigation channels, while artificial sunlight dimmed gradually toward evening mode overhead. Warm gold light reflected softly across Valera's blue-violet skin, while tiny droplets of water slid along green leaves around them. Ethan handed her a small orange fruit from one of the hydroponic trees. "Try it." Valera examined it suspiciously. "It appears underdeveloped." "That is because it is an orange." She took a careful bite, then blinked once in visible surprise. Ethan smirked immediately.
Right? Valera stared down at the fruit silently for several seconds before taking another bite.
It is pleasant.
Ethan leaned back against the hydroponic wall with a quiet smile. That might be the nicest thing you have said since arriving here. Valera ignored him, but she did not stop eating the orange either. The artificial sunset deepened slowly across the greenhouse while warm air drifted softly through the hidden chamber beneath the station. For the first time in 22 years, General Valera Thorne sat inside complete silence without scanning exits, counting threats, or waiting for impact warnings. And when Ethan looked over at her beneath the golden greenhouse lights, he realized something almost impossible had happened. The galaxy's most decorated soldier no longer looked like she was surviving. She looked peaceful. The warning arrived during breakfast. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter flipping protein pancakes with entirely too much concentration, while old jazz music crackled softly from the radio beside the coffee machine. Steam fogged the windows overlooking the frozen moon outside, and somewhere beneath the station floor, water pipes rattled lazily through the heating ducts. Valera sat across from him at the small metal table, wearing dark gray station clothes and quietly trimming dead leaves from a hydroponic vine she had carried up from the greenhouse earlier that morning. The scene looked absurdly peaceful. Then the proximity alarm exploded through the station speakers. Sharp, mechanical, immediate. Ethan nearly dropped the frying pan. The red emergency lights did not activate, but the scanner display above the kitchen table flashed bright amber across the room. Incoming vessels detected. Valera's entire body reacted instantly. The vine cutters hit the table. Her shoulders locked. Every trace of calm vanished from her expression in less than a heartbeat. Ethan saw it happen, like watching somebody drown beneath invisible water.
No,
she whispered quietly. Ethan crossed the room immediately and tapped the scanner controls. 3 ships appeared on the station radar. Large, military class, Dominion signatures. His stomach tightened. That cannot be good. Valera stood slowly from the table, eyes fixed on the scanner.
They found me.
The station hummed uneasily around them, while distant docking sirens echoed through the outer corridors. Ethan glanced toward her carefully. You expecting friends? Dominion retrieval fleets do not come as friends. Her voice sounded colder now, controlled again, decisions sliding back into place like armor locking shut. Ethan hated how quickly it happened. Only yesterday she had been sitting beneath greenhouse lights trying oranges for the first time. Now her posture looked carved from steel again. Valera moved immediately toward the guest quarters hallway. Ethan followed. Where are you going? To prepare. Prepare for what? She stopped near the doorway and turned toward him. Her amber eyes looked sharp enough to cut through metal again. I am General Valera Thorne of the Crimson Dominion. My disappearance destabilizes military command structures across 17 systems. Sounds unhealthy. It is war. Ethan crossed his arms quietly. I thought the war ended 4 years ago. Valera stared at him for a long moment before answering softly. Wars do not end for people built from them. Silence settled heavily between them. Ethan noticed her breathing shortening again.
the old reflexes returning one layer at a time. He hated that, too. Valera disappeared into the guest room briefly before emerging moments later, carrying the restored combat armor she had spent the last week refusing to wear. The silver-black plating reflected the station lights coldly, while old campaign medals glimmered across the chest piece like frozen stars. Ethan leaned against the hallway wall, watching her carefully.
"You really going to put that thing back on?" Valera paused. Her fingers rested against the armor plates silently.
"It is who I am."
Ethan shook his head slowly. "No." She looked up sharply.
"You do not understand."
"Maybe not." Ethan glanced toward the greenhouse access elevator at the far end of the corridor. "But I know who you are when you are not wearing it." Something flickered behind her eyes then. Pain, maybe, or fear. Hard to tell with soldiers. The docking alarm echoed again throughout the station. Valera closed her eyes briefly.
"If they discover I remained here voluntarily, they will classify this station as compromised."
Ethan shrugged lightly. Place was already compromised. Half the plumbing barely functions.
"Ethan,"
her voice softened unexpectedly.
"You do not understand the Dominion. They will expect me to return."
"Do you want to?" Valera did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened slowly against the armor plating in her hands. Then, finally, she whispered,
"I do not know who I become if I stop."
Ethan looked at her quietly beneath the pale station lights. For the first time since meeting her, he realized the thing terrifying Valera most was not war. It was emptiness afterward. The possibility that beneath the medals and victories and survival instincts, there might be nothing left at all. Ethan stepped closer carefully. "You know what I think? Humans usually tell me regardless." "Fair point." He nodded toward the armor. "I think somebody spent so long being necessary that she forgot she was allowed to just be alive." Valera stared at him in silence. The docking sirens stopped abruptly. A deep mechanical thud echoed faintly through the station structure as one of the Dominion ships connected to the outer bay. They had arrived. Valera looked toward the ceiling automatically, every instinct inside her shifting toward command mode again. Then Ethan spoke quietly beside her. "Hey." Her eyes moved back toward him. "Out there," he said softly, "they call you the Sword of Civilization, or whatever dramatic title they put on military broadcasts." Valera's expression remained unreadable. Ethan smiled faintly. "But down here?" He glanced toward the greenhouse elevator, toward the coffee machine still steaming in the kitchen, toward the tiny hydroponic vine resting forgotten on the table nearby. "Down here, your name is just Valera." For several long seconds, the station remained completely silent except for distant docking clamps settling into place outside the hull. Then something in Valera's face shifted. Small, fragile, human almost. And for the first time since the alarm sounded, her hand slowly loosened from the armor instead of tightening around it. The Dominion officers arrived exactly 7 minutes later. Ethan heard them before he saw them, heavy boots striking metal corridors in perfect synchronized rhythm, controlled, precise, military. The sound echoed through Kepri Ring like the return of something ancient and unwelcome. Valera stood motionless near the observation deck window, while pale, frozen sunlight drifted across her silver-white hair. The combat armor remained untouched beside the hallway wall. Ethan noticed that immediately. He also noticed the way her breathing slowed deliberately before the officers reached them.
Not panic this time. Decision.
The station door hissed open sharply. 3 Dominion commanders entered in dark silver uniforms lined with crimson insignia. Tall, disciplined. Their expressions carried the cold restraint of people trained never to display surprise, although Ethan caught it anyway the moment they saw Valera standing there without armor, without weapons, dressed in simple station clothes beside a coffee mug and a hydroponic vine. The lead officer stepped forward immediately and lowered his head.
Supreme General.
Valera did not move.
Commander Rykos.
The Dominion Council has been searching continuously since the Kepri disaster. His voice remained formal. Careful. Your survival has altered political stability across 17 systems. Ethan leaned quietly against the kitchen doorway, holding his coffee while the station lights buzzed softly overhead. The entire conversation already sounded exhausting. Valera's amber eyes remained calm.
And yet the galaxy continued functioning.
None of the officers answered. Commander Rykos glanced briefly toward Ethan before returning his attention to her. A transport vessel is prepared for your immediate return. Silence settled heavily through the station. Somewhere behind the walls, old heating pipes knocked softly through the metal structure. Valera looked toward the frozen moon outside the observation window before finally asking, "Why?" Rykos blinked once. "Supreme General, why return?" The officers exchanged brief, uncertain glances. "Because the Dominion requires your leadership," Rykos answered carefully. "You remain the greatest military strategist in recorded history." Valera's expression did not change. "How many died under my command during the Charon offensive?" The room became very still. Ethan lowered his coffee mug slowly. Rykos hesitated. "The official records estimate I know the records." Her voice remained calm. "Worse, somehow, because of it." I asked how many. The commander looked downward briefly. "Approximately 400,000 Dominion personnel." Valera nodded once.
And the civilian sectors?
No answer. Ethan saw the tension tightening through the officer's posture now. Not fear exactly. Reverence, maybe. The dangerous kind. Valera turned slowly toward the armor resting against the hallway wall. The silver-black plating reflected cold light across the floor. Campaign medals lined the chest piece in rows of polished crimson and steel. Symbols of victory, symbols of survival, symbols of graves. Valera walked toward it quietly. Ethan watched her carefully from across the room. The station remained silent except for the low hum of machinery and the distant static music still drifting from the radio shelf. Valera reached down slowly and lifted one medal from the armor. A small silver eclipse surrounded by black stars. Ethan had never asked what any of them meant. He suddenly realized he did not want to know. Valera turned the medal over in her hand thoughtfully. This was awarded after the siege of Teleran. Her voice sounded distant now, like someone speaking through old memories. The Dominion called it a flawless victory. Her fingers tightened faintly around the medal. The atmosphere burned for 11 days. Nobody spoke. Valera removed the next medal carefully, then another. One by one, she detached them from the armor in complete silence, while the Dominion officers watched in visible confusion. Tiny metallic clicks echoed softly through the room, each time another decoration came free. Ethan noticed something then. Her hands were no longer shaking. Valera carried the medals slowly down the corridor toward the greenhouse elevator. The officers exchanged uncertain looks before following her. Ethan followed too.
The hidden garden beneath the station glowed softly beneath warm, artificial sunlight when the elevator doors opened.
Green vines swayed gently beneath the circulators, while water trickled quietly through irrigation channels along the floor. The Dominion officers stopped immediately upon entering. Shock finally broke through their discipline. One whispered quietly, "A biological preserve." Valera ignored him completely. She walked toward the center of the greenhouse and knelt slowly beside the hydroponic soil beds. Then, with calm, deliberate movements, she opened the final medal in her hand. Ethan frowned slightly. It was hollow inside. Grey ash rested within the metal casing. Valera's voice remained soft as she spoke. "Third Fleet Command." She tilted the medal carefully, letting the ashes fall into the soil beneath the flowering vines. None of them survived the retreat. The greenhouse remained completely silent, except for the soft circulation of warm air through leaves overhead. One by one, Valera opened the remaining medals. Ashes drifted downward into the soil like pale dust beneath the artificial sunlight. Entire divisions, entire fleets, entire histories reduced to handfuls of memory, carried inside decorations the galaxy called glorious. Ethan felt something heavy settle quietly in his chest while watching her. The Dominion officers stood frozen near the elevator doors, unable to interrupt.
Finally, only one medal remained in Valera's hand, the Eclipse insignia from Taloran. She stared at it for a very long time before placing it gently into the soil untouched. Not buried, left visible beneath the flowers. Then, slowly, she stood. Warm greenhouse light reflected softly across her blue-violet skin, while green leaves brushed gently against her sleeves. Commander Rykos stepped forward carefully. "Supreme General," he said quietly, "the Dominion still needs you." Valera looked around the greenhouse, at the vines climbing toward artificial sunlight, at the water flowing peacefully through the channel, at Ethan standing silently near the irrigation pumps wearing grease-stained station clothes and holding a coffee mug he had forgotten to drink from 20 minutes ago. Then she spoke so softly the room almost missed it. "For 22 years, she said, I believed surviving was the same thing as living." Her amber eyes drifted toward the tiny white flowers growing from the soil where the ashes now rested. "I was wrong." The Dominion ships departed 6 hours later. Ethan watched them through the observation deck window while frozen moonlight drifted across the station glass in pale silver reflections. 3 massive warships rotated slowly away from Kepri Ring before vanishing one by one into the darkness beyond the debris field. No speeches, no threats, no dramatic final orders. Just silence. Commander Rykos had stood near the docking corridor before leaving, staring at Valera for a long moment, like a man watching history refuse to follow its assigned script. In the end, he simply bowed once and said, "May you find peace, General." Valera answered quietly, "I think I finally found where to start looking." Afterward, the station became strangely quiet again. Not empty. Different. Like the metal walls themselves had exhaled. Ethan returned to repairing the ventilation system, because that was apparently how he processed emotionally significant moments. The old maintenance ladder creaked beneath his boots while he worked near the ceiling ducts above the kitchen. Warm air hissed softly through newly repaired vents, carrying the scent of coffee and greenhouse soil throughout the station. Below him, Valera sat at the kitchen table, trimming another hydroponic vine beneath the yellow overhead lights. She moved slowly now, deliberately. No combat precision, no constant scanning of exits. Every so often, Ethan glanced down from the ladder
and caught himself staring for a second too long.
It still felt impossible seeing her like this. The woman entire systems once feared, now quietly arguing with a basil plant because she thought the leaves looked unhealthy. "You are overwatering it," Ethan called down casually. Valira narrowed her glowing amber eyes toward him. "You assigned me this responsibility, and now I regret it." A soft sound escaped her throat again, closer to actual laughter this time. Ethan nearly missed tightening the vent bolts because of it. He smiled quietly to himself before climbing back down the ladder. The station lights dimmed automatically toward evening mode, while old jazz piano drifted softly from the radio shelf nearby. Outside the observation windows, snowstorms rolled slowly across the frozen moon below, like white oceans moving in silence. Valira stood from the table eventually and walked toward the greenhouse elevator, carrying the trimmed vines carefully in both hands. Ethan followed a few minutes later with 2 cups of mint tea balanced awkwardly on a maintenance tray. The greenhouse glowed warm beneath artificial sunset lighting when he entered. Golden light spilled softly across leaves and irrigation channels, while tiny droplets of water shimmered along the vines. Valira stood near the flower beds in complete stillness, gazing down at the soil where the ashes from her metals had been scattered earlier that day. Small white blossoms had already begun opening there beneath the warmth. Ethan walked beside her quietly and handed over one of the tea mugs. She accepted it without looking away from the flowers. "Commander Rykos will report your refusal to the Dominion Council," Ethan said softly. Valira nodded once. "Yes. You worried about that?" Silence stretched briefly between them. Then she answered, "For most of my life, I believed fear was necessary for order." Ethan sipped his tea quietly. "And now?" Valira looked around the greenhouse slowly. At the growing vines, the warm lights, the quiet water channels flowing through the floor. "Now I think peace may require more courage." Ethan glanced toward her carefully.
That sounded dangerously philosophical. "You are a poor influence." "I get that a lot." The greenhouse settled into comfortable silence afterward. Not awkward, just still. The kind of silence that no longer demanded vigilance. Ethan eventually leaned back against the hydroponic railing, while Valira sat near the flower beds with her tea resting untouched beside her. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Neither seemed to care. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Valira's eyes had closed. Her breathing remained slow and even beneath the golden lights. No tension in her shoulders, no twitching reflexes every 12 seconds, no invisible alarms firing behind her eyes. Ethan straightened slightly. "Valira?" No answer. He stepped closer carefully. The tea mug remained warm in her hands, while strands of silver-white hair rested softly against her cheek beneath the greenhouse light. She had fallen asleep. Ethan stood perfectly still beside her for several long seconds. Somehow the moment felt more fragile than anything he had witnessed aboard battlefields or collapsing stations or drifting warships. The galaxy's most decorated soldier had probably slept in command bunkers, armored transports, military compounds, and orbital carriers across half the known systems. But even there, she had never truly rested. Not really. Gently lifted the untouched tea mug from her hands and placed it beside the flowers. Valira never stirred. Outside the station windows, frozen stars drifted silently beyond the greenhouse glass, while warm artificial sunlight glowed softly across blue-violet skin, marked by old scars and older wars. Ethan pulled a nearby blanket over her shoulders carefully,
before lowering the greenhouse lights another shade dimmer. Then he sat quietly beside the irrigation channels, watching the water move through the roots beneath the flowers grown from ashes. And for the first time in 22 years, General Valira Thorne slept without reaching for a weapon, without hearing sirens, without preparing for another battle. Somewhere beyond the frozen moon and silent stars, the galaxy kept spinning the way galaxies always do. But deep beneath an old mining station held together by rust, coffee, and stubborn human kindness, the woman once called the Sword of Civilization finally rested long enough to dream about something other than war.
Thank you for watching until the end. Watch the full story in the comments and video description. Like and subscribe to the channel to see more interesting content.